Dr. Matt Bernstein, what's the number one food legitimately destroying the brain?
It's sugar. Anything that spikes insulin and blood glucose is bad for the brain.
What's it actually doing to the brain?
Well, there's a lot of things, but number one, it's increasing reactive oxygen species, oxidative stress. This is really bad for energy production in all the brain cells. And without the right amount of energy, the brain cells can't do what they're supposed to do.
So it's not just, a bunch of, brain cells doing computer work. I mean, it's literally energy like everything else in our body. Like it's ATP, it's just the same general energy just concentrated in the brain.
Yeah, it's exactly the same. But even more importantly, the brain is so energy intensive. It's even more important in the brain, energy production. The brain is about 2% of the weight of the body and uses more than 20% of our energy at any one time.
But I mean, if you look at what the common belief is that, sugar gives you energy. So, and we've always been told that, you want to eat sugar when you're cramming for a test and everything like that. And if the brain is such a glucose hog and likes sugar so much, why do we run into this problem?
Well, it's really about too much of a good thing. So yes, our brain needs glucose and it runs on glucose. But when the glucose levels get too high, that causes all kinds of stress in the brain. And people might notice if you eat a lot of sugar at once, you might feel okay cognitively right away, but 20 minutes later, you're starting to get some brain fog. And that's the glucose going way too high. And then that's causing all kinds of stress for those cells.
So is that brain fog that you're feeling, is that like literally ROS, reactive oxygen species,
Yes.
like in action?
Yeah, it is.
Whoa. So what's happening there? Like if we mechanistically look at that, like I'm a visual person and I think a lot of my audience is too, like paint me a picture of what that looks like.
Yeah, it's complicated. But essentially, we're overwhelming the mitochondria, with too much energy, essentially. And then that backs up and with reactive oxygen species, there's a feedback loop, essentially, to the mitochondria saying, you got to slow down right now. And they stop working.
Really?
Yeah.
So they actually like pump the brakes because
Yeah.
it's like I have flown an airplane, but you play those flight simulators as a kid, and I know that's like, and you get into overspeed, right? And it's like it actually like you get into overspeed and it actually causes everything to kind of shut down, right?
That's right. Yeah, our body has these feedback mechanisms, negative feedback. So essentially when it's getting too much, it needs to get back to homeostasis. And that's exactly what starts happening. And then really bad things start happening because then we make this big surge of insulin that's going to really bring down blood glucose and brain glucose. And then we're in this hypoglycemic space, which really shuts down the brain in really difficult ways.
How quickly does that happen? Or is it bio-individual? Like, if I have like a piece of candy or something, it's like you said, it's like 4 minutes, like single digit minutes, my brain feels good.
Yeah.
And then it's pretty darn quick that I just go in. It's legitimately like riding a roller coaster of emotions. Like you actually feel depression come on. Like you physically feel it come on. And you're like, If you're aware of it, you're like, whoa. So how long does that take just to have these symptoms kind of pop up?
Yeah, it's pretty quick. As you said, I mean, the hyperglycemia problem happens pretty quick with that reactive oxygen species, oxidative stress. And then as you know, your glucose may stay high for a little while, but then when that starts rapidly going down, maybe 45 minutes later, an hour later, you get that real crash.
Yeah.
And that, that can last for hours until you get that glucose fix again. And that's what people are really on this roller coaster.
So independent of the short-term roller coaster, which is obviously not fun and not ideal, when we start looking longer term or even middle term, what is happening with chronically high insulin? Because I think sometimes people get a little confused on, high blood sugar versus hyperinsulinemia, right?
Right.
They go hand in hand, but they really are two different things. Like, what is hyperinsulinemia specifically in the brain, and how does insulin itself affect the brain over the long term?
Right.
I put a link down below for the creatine that I recommend. It's a company called Create. That is a 54% off discount link. So that gets you up to 54% off their creatine gummies that are sweetened with allulose. So there's allulose and there's a little bit of sugar because sugar helps creatine uptake, but it's combined with allulose, which actually blocks some of the glucose transporter. So it makes it so it's not affecting your glucose. So it's a cool combination they put together, but their flavors, their gummies are awesome. And there was recently a third-party study where they looked at a bunch of different creatine gummy brands, and Create was one of the only ones that actually had the amount of creatine that they said they had. So that link down below for more than 50% off their gummies. I also put a link down below for their stick packs if you just want straight monohydrate powder. But they are the bee's knees when it comes to creatine.
Great question. So essentially now we're getting in this realm of insulin resistance. This idea that chronically high insulin, eventually those cells don't respond to that signal anymore, and they're now resistant to insulin. And neurons, the main signaling cells in the brain are neurons. They need insulin to get glucose into the cell. So almost all mental health conditions are involved with some amount of brain insulin resistance. And if you have brain insulin resistance, it makes any mental health problem much worse. And so what happens is those neurons literally can be bathed in glucose. You might have just had the carbohydrates, the sugar, the blood glucose is high, the brain glucose is high, but none of that glucose can get into those neurons to be used for fuel. So that's what we call cerebral glucose hypometabolism. It's a mouthful, but essentially means high glucose, but no energy.
Interesting. So at that rate, do you have an increase in oxidative stress, or is it really just glycation that's kind of happening there?
It's really an energetics problem.
Okay.
We literally aren't getting the fuel into those cells, and they're starving for energy, and they stop functioning.
Do they eventually die?
They can die eventually. That's what atrophy is. That's what, mild cognitive impairment and eventually dementia is. Eventually those cells will die, but there's many processes along the way. But even if they're not dying, they're just not functioning well. And then things like anxiety happen, depression, and sometimes even worse in terms of mental health.
Wow. So I want to definitely talk about the fixes, and we're going to get to that in a minute. But I have one just kind of nerdy question, because I'm curious what happens metabolically with anxiety at that rate. Like, so if the neurons aren't able to function properly and not able to, running into an energetics issue, how exactly does that spin into anxiety? Is it just like weird synapses firing, kind of randomly?
Yeah. Essentially, the cells aren't doing what they're supposed to do. And so, to be in a calm state, we need a certain amount of the neurotransmitter GABA, for example. And instead, what ends up happening is we'll have an excess of this excitatory neurotransmitter, glutamate. And when we have too much glutamate and not enough GABA, we get very anxious. And other things can start happening. Even, things like seizures can start happening in that situation.
I don't want to go too far down this rabbit hole, but I know that some of the epilepsy research is still a little bit rocky. They're still understanding everything behind it. But are we starting to understand that the reason that ketones play such a role with epilepsy is because of the GABAergic effect? Is that kind of...
It's one of the mechanisms. Yeah, there's many mechanisms by which ketogenic diets can help epilepsy. And one of them is increasing GABA and lowering glutamate.
So it's like, the reason I asked that question isn't, I know I probably don't have a ton of epileptics watching this, but it makes me connect some dots that perhaps even anxiety to a degree is like somewhat functioning almost in that same parallel, right? It's just a GABAergic, glutamatergic issue, right? Whereas it's like, I don't want to put the cart before the horse and say that it's like a miniature seizure, but in a way, it's like this malfunction in the predictive values that the brain is trying to create with, looking at the future, right? So it's like panicking because you have this excess glutamate. So it's like tripping out about the future, creating more anxiety.
That's right. Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it.
That's So then let's talk kind of some fixes here. Obviously, we just mentioned ketosis, ketogenic diet, which anyone that's watched my videos or seen your talks or seen your lectures, knows that you are an expert in that world. But independent of even ketosis itself, because maybe people aren't ready to go that route, or maybe they just need a little bit more education on it. So independent of that, what can we start doing to possibly reverse some of these issues with the brain? But I think a lot of people also want short-term fixes. Like, how can they just feel sharper? Like, what can they do now to start feeling sharper today?
Yeah. Well, I do think getting off that carbohydrate, sugar roller coaster is probably the most important thing people can start doing. You don't have to shoot for a full ketogenic diet, but just reduce the sugar. A reasonable amount of sugar per day might be, 20, 25 grams of sugar a day. but people are eating 90, 100 or more grams of sugar per day. That's really problematic for the brain. So even if someone doesn't want to do a full ketogenic diet, just getting off that sugar carbohydrate roller coaster, avoiding processed grains too, same thing. Those essentially get converted to glucose, give a huge insulin spike in a similar way to the way sugar does.
What about, we talk about healthy fats for the brain. Is that, I don't want to say it's overrated, but sometimes I feel like that discussion gets boilerplated a little bit. Like, you're immediately eating these healthy fats and they're immediately going to the brain. And, so I know that's important, but are there any fats that you can consume that have a direct impact on the brain? I mean, I'll name one out the gate. I've seen some cool studies with like network stability and MCT oil, right?
Yeah.
I don't know if you're familiar with that paper that came out. It was a couple of years ago. It was a really interesting paper, basically talking about, brain energetics and independent of a ketogenic diet, MCT oil increased network stability, basically the regions of the brain being able to communicate with one another. Are you familiar with like how MCT oil affects the brain? I'm trying to think of like maybe shortcuts that people can start with. Maybe they're like, okay, I understand ketogenic diet might be good. I'm not ready to take that leap. Are there some ways that I can kind of get a taste of it to help kind of tilt the brain over towards this different energetic tone?
Yeah, I'm glad you brought up MCT oil because that's something I recommend to my patients all the time. Even people who don't want to do a ketogenic diet, sometimes the way we'll start is, okay, just clean up, whole foods, less sugar to start. Then, if we can get people exercising, amazing. That's going to help tremendously, and we can go into that. But then the next step I often recommend is a little bit of time-restricted eating and MCT oil in the morning instead of food. That will boost their ketones a little bit, and that has immediate powerful effects on the brain. For someone whose brain isn't used to getting any ketones, it's like people come back and they just say, wow, what was that?
Yeah.
It's really profound. Yeah.
Does it, so even it's just in a fasted state, let's say someone had dinner, maybe it's been 10 hours, 12 hours.
Yeah.
Are they usually in a state at that rate where if they were to have MCT oil, they could actually get a modest amount of ketones?
They definitely can. Yeah, there's some studies actually for people with mild cognitive impairment, and they didn't even fast these people. So these are people in the early stages right before you get dementia. They have some cognitive impairment. And they give them MCT oil. They measure their cognition before the MCT oil and after. And there's a very significant difference with one dose of MCT oil.
Wow.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's powerful stuff. And, so even if someone's pretty insulin resistant and they ate 12 hours later, they're going to have some insulin around. We can measure fasting insulins and they're not as low as we would like them to be, but the body will still make ketones from the MCT oil. And it's not, they may not have a huge spike in ketones. It's not like taking an exogenous ketone, but it's enough if they're not used to getting any ketones to feel a very significant difference. Those neurons are starving for energy, if you think about it, and you get the ketones in, and ketones don't need insulin to get into neurons. That's the key point that bypasses that insulin resistance blockade.
So you're essentially getting a backdoor way into the cell.
Exactly. Yeah.
So if you do that, can you eventually allow the cell, I guess what I'm saying is, are you married to that forever? Or by giving your body a break from that insulin and using that back doorway, do you eventually give the front door a chance to figure out how to open again?
Yeah, exactly. You do. Because what ends up happening is if you're not, if you can reverse that brain insulin resistance, eventually then those neurons can start using glucose appropriately again. And they really never stop using glucose. It's just that they can use more of it again.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you ever see in your work or with your patients, I mean, how quickly can this potentially happen? I mean, I'm careful to, put hard times on this, but I mean, how quickly you just start seeing improvement in like brain energetics and potentially even insulin resistance in the brain?
Yeah, it is very individual. It depends on sort of what their metabolic state is going in, how long have they been metabolically unhealthy, how much brain insulin resistance do they have. Some people start feeling that immediate effect from getting a little bit of ketones going, literally within the first week, they start feeling better. There's other people where the other mechanisms by which ketones might help the brain need to kick in for them to really start feeling those benefits. And that means they really need to adapt to ketosis. That could take anywhere from a couple of weeks to even a couple of months for some people.
So what does it look like for someone that is, they've been insulin resistant for years, right?
Yeah.
They start a ketogenic diet, they start restricting carbohydrates, maybe they add those fats, is there a period of time where their brain might not feel good as they're acclimating? Or do you generally see, hey, like, no, I do notice some improvement immediately, but it takes a couple of months to get to that kind of peak point with that fat adaptation and keto adaptation? Is it slightly different in the brain than it is in other areas of the body, or does it really work almost the exact same way?
I think, again, very individualized, but usually people, if they're noticing, they do start feeling some benefits within that first week or two. Often some cognitive benefits. And again, that's that mechanism where we're bypassing that insulin resistance blockade. We get another source of fuel into the brain, and that's almost immediate. Once we start making ketones, those are getting into the neurons. They're starting to use those, and they're waking up because now they have enough energy. But then really the long-term benefits come from these other adaptations. And a lot of those have to do with mitochondria.
What about and this is a little bit more of an advanced question, but it's something that's always interested me. There's obviously what's called a glucose sparing effect, at least in the body, right? I'm not going to speak for the brain right now, but in the body, a glucose sparing effect where you essentially are creating what's called that peripheral insulin resistance temporarily, or not even temporary, but it's peripheral. It's not pathological, where you're actually just, you're down-regulating your glucose tolerance and an ability to be able to utilize fats more. For a while, I thought, could the glucose sparing effects in the body be contributing to the improved energetics in the brain? Because is there a reallocation of glucose to the brain? But as I'm listening to you talk with this, that seems like that would be problematic. That wouldn't be a good thing if you had a reallocation of glucose to the brain in someone that's insulin resistant, right? But I don't know if that's tracking, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, the way I look at it is that, people who are on a very low carbohydrate diet or a ketogenic diet for a long period of time, their pancreas just isn't ready to release insulin. So if they do eat glucose, they're going to have a bit of a glucose spike because they don't have that ready insulin ready to go. But they can easily start making it. So that effect is very temporary.
Got it.
Yeah.
You think about people that are starting a ketogenic diet, maybe they get the keto flu, or they feel kind of lethargic in the beginning. Is that generally just an adaptation period, or is it the fact that a ketogenic diet to a certain degree does generate its own respective amount of reactive oxygen species, but that's part of the benefit is the body actually kind of upregulates other systems and processes it's almost like a good reactive oxygen species, right? It's an acclimatization that happens, right?
Yeah. Well, we want a certain amount of reactive oxygen species. We can't think of all oxidative stress as bad. And every time we burn fuel of any kind, we're making some. And they're actually signaling molecules in the brain, telling our brain to do certain things at a certain amount. It's really just when we have too much that we get into problems.
Yeah. I'd imagine it's a very fine line too.
Yeah, that's right.
I mean, because you exercise, you're creating a lot of ROS too.
Absolutely. Right. Yeah. So that's where we get into this idea of like sort of hormetic stressors. Yeah. Like all of this we're talking about these are hormetic stressors. But if you overdo it, then the body gets overwhelmed and it's not going to feel so good for a little while. And thinking about transitioning into a ketogenic state, this idea of keto flu, we've now transitioned people into ketosis very quickly a number of times, just right away. They come in and we just put them on a 1.5 or 2-to-1 ketogenic diet. And we're not seeing keto flu very much at all. Because as long as people really stay very hydrated and the right amount of electrolytes and are eating really healthy version of a ketogenic diet, it just doesn't seem to happen very often.
I would imagine, especially with like more serious mental conditions and more serious, metabolic issues in the brain, it's like even if there was a keto flu, it's like the positive effects would far supersede, the keto flu, right? If like you were in such a bad metabolic state in the brain, it's like simply removing the glucose alone is probably going to add a benefit that's above and beyond what you would feel with the keto flu, right? So it's like going to supersede that, eclipse that, so to speak.
Yeah. I mean, we mostly see it in this couple of day period of time when they don't have their glucose isn't high anymore. So we've dropped their blood glucose down and therefore their brain glucose down, but they haven't started quite making ketones yet. Mm-hmm. So there can be a little bit of a vulnerable period for a couple of days, but it goes away very quickly. Usually the body starts making ketones pretty quickly. Yeah.
A little bit of a blunt question, just because I really am curious, like in the medical and mental health community, why has there been so much resistance to a ketogenic diet? I mean, it seems like it's lightening up, but it seems like it goes through surges. And, I understand if you don't want to speak to it too much, but like, what is, like, I don't understand. Like, this is very clear. The science is very legit. There's very esteemed people talking about, why is there still resistance to this?
It's a great question. Yeah. I mean, I think you can answer that so many different ways, but it's just a different way of thinking. Yeah. It's thinking about really genuinely using food as medicine. And that's means we're not using other things as medicine.
Sure.
And so you can think about it. People have trained to use certain techniques, medications, procedures. Yeah. This is what they've trained their lives to do. And they've studied so hard to learn all these things. And we're coming in and saying, oh, well, we can actually just prevent that illness or even reverse it with a diet. First of all, that's very threatening.
Yeah.
But also then, there's issues, there's complications. It's not easy to do. There are people who get into trouble and they're going to emphasize all those problems. Yeah. Of course, they're not emphasizing all the problems and side effects necessarily with these medications, especially in my field in psychiatry. There's huge amounts of problems with the medications.
Yeah.
And people sort of gloss those over and they worry about, maybe your LDL going up a little bit on a ketogenic diet, even though your cardiac risk goes down.
Yeah.
But they're focused on that LDL going up. That's the problem. Yeah.
Do you, if you speak to, as a psychiatrist, the issues, then the side effects that you deal with some of these pharmaceuticals for mental illness and psychiatric conditions, has there been any evidence for the ketogenic diet actually kind of mitigating some of the side effects of these medications? So rather than coming at this and saying like almost aggressively that's going to put the pharmaceutical industry possibly on a defensive or put the medical community on a defensive because they spent years doing this and it's bureaucratic change and it's just there's resistance to it. So rather than putting can they be used in adjunct with these medications to improve the effectiveness of these medications?
Absolutely. And that's what we're doing all the time. People who are taking medications for a significant mental health condition, and yet they have a lot of side effects. Maybe they've gained 20 or even 50 or 80 pounds. They've got insulin resistance. Their lipid profile's a mess. A lot of that is due to the medication. We can put them on a low carbohydrate or a ketogenic diet. They're going to get some brain health benefits, but they're also going to get huge metabolic benefits. So we can have them lose weight. They can reverse some of that insulin resistance. Their lipid panel looks better. And then often we can get them on a lower dose of the medication where they actually feel much better. And so for some people, they can even potentially get off the medication. But for many people, that's not their goal. Their goal is just to feel vibrant and energetic and cognitively flexible again and living life.
What about, you mentioned earlier the effect of exercise, and I know some people can start to tune out as soon as they hear exercise. So I want to, we're going to get into some interesting stuff because I think I know some of the directions you're going to go with this, and it's good stuff. You want to stick around on it. Like, essentially, I had Dr. Nick Fabiano on the channel. We were talking about just the effects of exercise on depression and things like that, but we didn't get into like almost the metabolic mechanisms behind it.
Yeah.
With exercise specifically and its impact on mental health conditions and the impact on the brain, just independent of mental health conditions. Are you essentially emulating what you're doing with the ketogenic diet, or are there benefits kind of above and beyond just the substrate utilization?
Exercise and ketogenic diets both are tremendously powerful for the brain. And my ideal is that people are doing both. And their mechanisms are somewhat overlapping. There's some that are the same, and then there's some that are a little bit different. For exercise, we get a specific blood flow increase to the brain. So that's, dilation of blood vessels from exercise, and we get more blood flow to the brain. That's going to be beneficial. More nutrients coming in, more waste products coming out. That's great. People talk about the effects of exercise on increasing BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which adds the ability for neurons to connect to each other more. Each neuron connects to thousands of other neurons, but the more they can connect to others, the more flexible our brain is, the more adaptive it is, the better our mental health is. But BDNF isn't created directly from exercise. Actually, there's a really wonderful paper that shows the mechanism by which exercise increases BDNF is through ketones.
Really?
Yeah. It's amazing.
How's that happening? It's just by the production of ketones through exercise?
Yeah.
And just in general?
Yeah. That's right.
Even people that are not maybe doing intense exercise or long duration?
Yeah. Well, you need to do intense exercise to create enough BDNF to matter, right?
True.
But if you do intense exercise, even if you're not low carb, you're making ketones.
Dang.
Yeah.
So does that mean that, wow. So if the BDNF is a result of the ketones that are formed during, long enough or more intense exercise, it's going to produce those ketones, whether you're aware of it or not. I think I say that to people all the time that were maybe resistant to the ketogenic diet. Like, have you ever done an hour-long workout?
Yeah.
Well, you are probably producing a lot of ketones.
Absolutely. Absolutely they are. Yeah.
So does that mean that we can emulate some of the same effects just by being on a ketogenic diet, or possibly even exogenous ketones at that rate? Or do you have to kind of be in that AMPK state already sort of from exercise for that to take effect?
No, you get some of the benefits from ketogenic diets. I mean, one of the mechanisms, they've been studying ketogenic diets for the brain for decades because of the epilepsy literature. And one of the mechanisms by which ketogenic diets improve epilepsy is through increasing BDNF. So the diet itself, ketones itself, increase BDNF, whether you exercise or not. But if you do both, then you're getting this huge boost in BDNF, which is exactly what we want for better mental health.
So does that mean, because BDNF is largely responsible for neuroplasticity in many ways?
Exactly. Yeah, that's what I was trying to allude to. I didn't use the term neuroplasticity, but this idea of neurons connecting to more neurons, that's what neuroplasticity is all about. And that's what makes our brain more flexible. We can deal with stress, we can adapt, we can live our best life.
Yeah, see, I love that you say that because I think neuroplasticity gets roped into just the psychedelic conversations all the time. Like, okay, you get neuroplasticity, you change your brain. But I love looking at BDNF and looking at neuroplasticity from exactly how you described it. It's the real-time changes, the real-time stuff you can do. I mean, long-term, being able to change your brain, I'm here for it. Like I'm pro psychedelic therapy. I'm pro all that. I big fan of it. But I've always looked at neuroplasticity as like, yes, that's your ability to sort of weather the storm when you get into these the short-term effect is the part that I think is really underrated and not talked about.
That's right.
Yeah,
absolutely. Yeah.
So is that why? I mean, because you have the GABA piece that we talked about, right?
Yeah.
There's a feeling, if anyone's ever done a ketogenic diet, where I always liken it to like a calm brain is a fast brain. Like you're clicked on, you're extremely just acutely aware of everything that's going on, but you're eerily calm. Yeah. You're not like, where you feel jittery. And so is that maybe a combination of the GABA and the BDNF that you're feeling there, or are there other reasons why you just feel so calm and fast?
I mean, I wish I knew all the answers to that. I mean, those are great questions. But yeah, I think it's probably more. I mean, it's other neurotransmitters, serotonin, dopamine, norepinephrine, all of those things are involved in those processes. But what you're describing there, I mean, that's that calm but aware state. That's exactly what people are trying to cultivate with mindfulness too, as well, right? Which is about lowering cortisol, lowering inflammation, all of the benefits. It's all works together. Yeah. And these are just powerful ways to get into the same processes, essentially. And so people can choose, how they want to get into these processes, but ultimately this is where we got to get for true mental health.
What about, you mentioned serotonin briefly.
Yeah.
What can you tell me about the relationship with ketones and serotonin? Do we know much there?
I don't think we know much.
Yeah.
It's like a different paradigm, essentially, of mental health. I mean, we've been stuck in the serotonin paradigm for depression for so long, and it really
that's not the actual issue.
Well, there's actually some really interesting papers that have come out saying that it's not the main issue, actually. Yep. And we know that some people do respond to serotonergic antidepressants, but many people don't.
You're just eclipsing. You're just clouding an issue is what you're doing. Like that's kind of always been my take. Not even necessarily with SSRIs in general, but just that I'm glad we're on the same page with that potentially, because like I've thought that for a while, that like serotonin just seems like such a drop in the bucket for all these things. Like that like if you can increase serotonin, you can make someone feel better, but it's not. I mean, you could you give someone ecstasy and they'd feel better because they have a bunch of serotonin. You know what I mean? It's not that doesn't fix the actual issue.
It's not the root cause issue for most people. That's right. And so it's very rare in my field that someone gets fully back to their full mental health and full functioning just from a serotonergic antidepressant. Yeah. Usually it's that plus lifestyle changes, the things we're talking about with exercise and diet, or that plus a really important round of psychotherapy or mindfulness practice. The serotonergic antidepressant doesn't usually get people all the way to where they need to go, almost never.
What about, are we in the same vein of with dopamine as well? Not really understand. I mean, I know there's gotta be, I've seen some preliminary research but nothing looking at it directly, but you just see these like changes in dopamine baseline when people are on a ketogenic diet. And I don't think we understand why yet. It's probably, obviously that's a very complicated world that even the best neuroscientists in the world still haven't fully figured out.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I mean, once we get into this level of neuroscience, we don't have answers. I mean, the reality is the brain is the most complicated thing in the universe. We are not capable of fully understanding it, and we're learning more and more every day. But the more we learn, the more we realize we don't know all these answers yet.
What about from the side of alcohol for a moment? Because I talked about this a little bit with Dr. Chris Palmer, and I thought it was very interesting. Like, there's a relationship between alcohol and the metabolic health of the brain, right?
Yeah. I mean, alcohol, causes, impairments in the liver almost immediately. Your liver is all of a sudden, focused on metabolizing that alcohol, and it can't do what else it's doing to support the brain, right? And so we have some problematic things on that regard. One drink is probably not going to make a profound difference for most people, but the other effect that it has, though, is reducing quality of sleep. And we know, how important sleep is for both brain health and metabolic health. Even one poor night of sleep and all kinds of things happen that we don't want. Cognitive performance plummets from one poor night of sleep. Metabolic health plummets from one poor night of sleep. And so we know that if you have a couple of drinks, that's what's going to happen to your sleep.
Yeah. It's, have you seen, I think, Chris has talked about this a little bit, but have you seen sort of basically when someone is a functioning alcoholic, essentially what's happening metabolically in the brain is like they're starting to essentially use that alcohol as like a metabolic fuel. And that's why they feel more normal when they have a drink. And evidently, like, we're starting to find that ketones can sort of override that, where it's like this resistant brain cell. It's not able to get fuel in otherwise. And through the same mechanism which alcohol would essentially create first acetaldehyde, I can't remember what it is that actually goes into the brain cell itself. That's, further downstream from alcohol consumption. But essentially a ketone is using that same backdoor mechanism. So a functioning alcoholic could feel normal again when they actually consume ketones versus alcohol that they couldn't get with sugar, they couldn't get with food.
Yeah, that's actually quite true. And in fact, there's a couple of really nice studies done at the National Institute of Drug Abuse. And so federally funded studies, randomized controlled trials showing that alcoholics, people who are truly physically dependent on alcohol, come into a unit to get detoxified from alcohol. They put some of them on a ketogenic diet and other ones not on a ketogenic diet. The ones on a ketogenic diet needed less medication to come off of alcohol, and they had far fewer cravings for alcohol as well, just from being on a ketogenic diet. And they could see changes in the brain as well that were consistent with how that worked. Yeah,
it truly makes me wonder if that is one of the reasons why people have less just general cravings on a ketogenic diet.
Oh yeah.
Like we've always, back when I was creating tons of keto content, and it was just like, it was always just coming back to GLP-1. It was coming back to, the inflammatory markers. It was coming back to that as the basic reasons why maybe you weren't as hungry, or because you had, a more calorically dense fuel floating around all the time. But now it's almost as though, through that same mechanism that we're seeing with alcoholism, that perhaps ketones are affecting the neurochemistry and the neuropsychiatry that's actually making us literally want to eat less.
Yeah. Yeah. When the brain has ketones, it's not going to send out hunger signals. If you think about where ketones fit in our evolutionary history, we would go through periods where there was no food. And that's why we make ketones, because our brain needed to function in order to survive when we had no food. And so, a couple days into not having food, if we were getting low energy and we couldn't think, we wouldn't be here anymore. We wouldn't have survived as a species. And that's where ketones come in. It's our liver says, okay, brain, you need fuel to be able to go get us food. We're going to send you some ketones. And now your brain has all the energy it needs and you don't feel hungry anymore. And so people know, 2-3 days into a fast, when their ketone levels are super high, they don't feel hungry anymore. Right? It's the direct effect of ketones on the brain.
Yeah. Because it's not like, I'm sure if your brain was clicked on to wanting to eat, you'd feel hungry. It's not, anyone that's ever done that, it's not like your body's not, it's up here. It's something switches in your brain, something switches in your mind. it's not just that very few people are actually starving, at least in the US, like actually starving, right? Like our brain is going to tell us you're hungry, you're starving.
But that's because the brain doesn't have fuel anymore.
Exactly.
It's running out of energy.
Yeah.
So those neurons in the hypothalamus say, well, we don't have enough energy. We need, their job is to, send all those hunger signals out. Yep. But if they have all the ketones they want, they've got all the energy they need, they're not sending hunger signals out anymore. Yep. And that's why people almost universally notice on a ketogenic diet, you don't feel very hungry.
Totally.
Right?
It's one of the reasons I have mixed feelings on GLP-1 receptor agonists, actually. Like, I mean, I'm not the biggest fan of everyone just jumping on them, but I also understand from an insulin resistance standpoint and its true mechanism of action, like perhaps for some people, it's actually changing the insulin resistance in the brain to a degree that when they do come off of these peptides, or when they come off of these GLP-1s, maybe they have actually a fighting chance of actually having lasting changes in the brain, right? So, and that's a perspective that I don't know if people talk about all the time, because so I have mixed feelings on it, because I do think about it from that perspective of like, hey, if we can get the brain firing on all cylinders, then you're going to feel like you're in more control of what you're eating.
Yeah, I've got mixed feelings too, but I do use them for some people to help them transition into this kind of diet and lifestyle and exercise again. So there are people who are so insulin resistant, metabolically unhealthy. They want to make these changes. They say, oh, I see this, I want to do it, but I just can't. They're just absolutely addicted. Yeah. Right? Then the food is made to be addictive. So they need sometimes a little help along the way. And the GLP-1s do reduce insulin resistance over time. And so, my goal would be maybe give them the lowest effective dose so that they can, get into a ketogenic state, use the medication for 3 or maybe 6 months, maybe 9 months at the most, get into that new lifestyle. Now they're resistance training, they're low carb, and then they don't need the GLP-1 anymore. And so instead of like in the studies, and what many people find out is they stop the medication, they gain all the weight back. Yeah. But if you make all those lifestyle changes, you're not going to gain all the weight back.
Yeah. Yeah, and generally, the studies on a dose that you can't titrate, right? So it's like you're looking at one large. I think there's a lot to kind of unpack with that, right? Oh, yeah. It's like if someone can, and there's potential even cognitive effects of a GLP-1. So it's like it might be just what people need sometimes to get over the hump. So yeah, totally with you on that. I do wonder about the co-administration of like exogenous ketones with the GLP-1 for the muscle sparing effect, for the brain effect, for that's an optimal time to really condition the brain to be able to maybe use those ketones better, right? If someone is either doing a ketogenic diet or not, but in adjunct to a GLP-1 receptor agonist hopping on, some exogenous ketones, that would be an interesting study. Quite sure.
But, yeah, I haven't tried that, but it's an interesting idea. Yeah.
Well, because you're working a different mechanism for appetite suppression, right? So it's like perhaps you could do a lower dose of a GLP-1, a more manageable dose that's going to have less risk of a rebound, right? And sort of couple that with ketones that are having this sort of muscle sparing effect as well, right?
Yeah, very cool idea. Yeah.
What would you say before we wrap this video up? I mean, what would you say the number one benefit of a ketogenic diet is through and through, whether it's for the brain or not?
That's a great question. I mean, I think to me, the number one benefit is longevity. Yeah. I think that this is a molecule for survival. It's a molecule that is going to condition our cells to be stronger all throughout our body. I'm most interested in the brain, but I do a ketogenic diet myself for the health span and longevity benefits.
Right on, man. Well, Dr. Bernstein, where can everyone find you?
So I'm on LinkedIn. I don't have a big social media presence.
Sure. Smart.
Yeah. I also have a company called Accord. So people can learn about the work we're doing on ketogenic diets and mental health by looking up accordmh.com.
Right on, man. Well, thanks, brother.
Thank you. Yeah.